Okay, so in this little sort of mini lecture, we're going to take a quick look at a few different theoretical approaches to determining aboutness. And there's all of these are covered in more detail in your textbook, but I just want to give you a little bit of an introduction here. So I want to talk a little bit about Patrick Wilson first. Patrick Wilson was a philosopher teaching library and information science in Berkeley in the 60s. And he wrote about some ways for carrying out the subject analysis process in his book, Two Kinds of Power, an essay on bibliographic control, which, by the way, this book, Two Kinds of Power, is really a major theoretical sort of foundational work in the history of subject analysis. So that's something to take more of a look at if this is an area that you're interested in. So in Two Kinds of Power, Patrick Wilson said, well, people tend to think that there is an obvious subject for any item that can be labeled the subject, but it may be much more complicated than that. There are facts, but there are also relationships, influences, biases, things that are left unstated or implied. So to try to help to deal with some of the problems that one encounters in subject analysis, he came up with 4 different approaches. And he said there may be no right way to determine aboutness. It may be none of these methods that gets it right, or it may be any or all of these, depending on the resource. Um, you might get many different answers applying these methods, or they might all give you the same answer. So for any given work, there's no single right way to approach it, according to Wilson. So Wilson's methods in brief were, first of all, the purposive method. So this is finding the author's aim or purpose and letting that guide your determination of what the aboutness of the resource is. So if the author's purpose is explicitly stated, then that's great, right? But you can probably easily imagine how this could get into some dangerous territory, especially in the humanities. It might not always be clear what the author's purpose is. It might be said once, it might be said multiple times. It might be said multiple times but in conflicting ways. It might not be said at all. Wilson's second method is the figure ground method. So try to identify some kind of central figure or central subject that stands out from the background that can be determined in that way to be the focus of the work. Keep in mind, though, that this is influenced by both the creator and the reader. So what stands out to one reader might not stand out to another reader with another background. So this figure ground method can end up being something that's extremely subjective. Wilson's third method is the objective method. So this is basically counting references to various topics. The idea being that those topics that are named with highest frequency are going to be the best for giving us some idea of the subject of the work. There are a few different problems with this as well. So frequently named topics may be background items, or the major topic may never be named explicitly as such. Also, something might be named the first time, but thereafter it might be called it or them or some other pronoun or some other word that we might not immediately recognize as standing for the subject. And then finally, Wilson's fourth message is the cohesion method. So looking at what holds the work together, what cohesiveness there is, what has been said and what is not said. Note, however, again, that this requires subject expertise to know what holds it together and what's been left out. So what it's not can be kind of a hard way to approach it if you don't already have pretty in-depth knowledge of the area that the work is dealing with. So saying that it's not about sea serpents or cooking lima beans or breeding rabbits, therefore it's about globalization. That's an exaggeration, but you can see how this could be a tricky method to apply in isolation. So that's Wilson. For contrast now, we're going to take a look quickly at Derek Langridge, who takes a very different view of conceptual analysis. So Langridge believes that there is one real right answer when addressing what something is about. There are no multiple answers. There's one right answer and the rest are just wrong. So he thinks that you need to ask the right questions. And they are, first of all, what is it about? So this addresses topics. Secondly, what is it? Talking about the form of knowledge. And then finally, what is it for? So this deals with discipline, the uses of a document, or to whom it may be addressed. And the answer to that third question in particular, what is it for, may affect the choice of classification especially. So a book about anatomy for nurses is not the same content as a book about anatomy for forensic pathologists, right? So language thinks that aboutness only really gets confusing when we mix up these three questions. We get confused about what question we are trying to answer. And then this is what leads to variations in our impressions of aboutness. So for example, if we have, let's say, two different titles, say we have one work called The History of Science, and then we have a second work called The Philosophy of Science. So History of Science and Philosophy of Science. If I ask, what are these two books about? You would probably say science, and you wouldn't be wrong. But looking at the items, the contents are vastly different, right? So the subject, that same subject, science in this case, can have more than one meaning. Now you could be more specific. You could say, what is it about? What is it in addition to what is it about? So if we take a closer look at history of science, well, that's probably talking about the past activities of people calling themselves scientists who pursue the knowledge of nature. On the other hand, philosophy of science addresses the system of beliefs accepted as authoritative in science. So these two works are different in their form of knowledge, and that what is it question clarifies that. History of science is history, whereas philosophy is philosophy, right? And then finally, this third question, what is it for? This can have a number of different answers. This can help clarify the audience or the discipline in which the work belongs or the uses of the document. So for language, the process of determining aboutness involves examining 5 different kind of basic areas. So he wants you to first of all look at the form of knowledge. So language identifies 12 kind of broad forms of knowledge, things like philosophy, history, art, religion, etc. And then almost as a subset of that, there's also the discipline. So there are many sub-areas under those 12 basic forms of knowledge that form the basis for our classification systems. He also wants you to look at the topic. So these are the sort of discrete subjects, and there may be billions of them. And then also the nature of thought. So we're looking here at point of view, culture, audience, intellectual level. And then finally, he wants you to look at nature of the text. So this is getting into the type of writing, the medium of communication, the structure. Another way to approach a subject analysis is through the use of categories. So we're talking here about very basic conceptual groupings based on some kind of intrinsic or perceived property of the items. Now, Ranganathan was one of the first in the field of library science to think very seriously about how categories applied to library and information science. And we will be taking a closer look at Ranganathan when we get into classification theory, in particular in a few weeks. But he thought, as this use of categories, of faceted categories, he thought of this as one way of representing how topics can be multifaceted. So he identified 5 fundamental categories to help determine topics. And this is often referred to as the PMEST or PMEST formula. So first of all, we have personality, the focal or most specific subject of the resource. We have matter, the materials, substances, or components that make up the subject. We have energy, an activity, a process, or an operation. Space, so a place, a geographic location of the subject, and then finally time, a chronological period associated with the subject, a year, a season, a century, etc. So for examples, this is sort of one of the classic examples you'll probably see around. If I have a work on automobile manufacturing in the upper Midwest, in the mid-20th century. I can sort of facet that subject out into the different categories proposed by Ranganathan. So again, my work is about automobile manufacturing in the upper Midwest in the mid-20th century. So in this case, the personality facet is automobiles. That's sort of the core focal subject. Manufacturing in this case would be the energy facet, so that's the activity or operation that the work deals with. In this particular case, we don't have anything for the matter facet. That's okay, not all of the different facets have to be used at the same time, but we would have the space facet used, so upper Midwest, and then for the time facet, mid-20th century. So this is a way of sort of representing all of those different aspects of the subject. Another approach involving the use of categories for subject analysis is that of the Classification Research Group, or the CRG. This was a group that was active in England in the 1950s and 60s, and it included Derek Langridge, who we already saw a few slides ago, as well as some other kind of big figures in 20th century subject analysis like Jack Mills, the Foskett brothers, Brown, Derek Austin, and a few others as well. And this group was really a major contributor to classification theory in the 20th century, particularly associated with various kinds of faceted classification. Their approach was definitely inspired and influenced by Ranganathan, and their categories did differ a little bit from Ranganathan's, as you can see on this slide here, but not by that much. So there are definitely some affinities. So their categories are, first of all, the entities of chief concern within a discipline. So this might be, for example, something like the end products in technology or the natural object in science. Secondly, the parts of entities. So within biology, things like the bodily organs, or within mechanical engineering, machine parts, or within religious studies, various religious sects. Number three, constituents or properties of those entities or parts. So things like matter, material, size. Number four, processes. These are generally organic processes, things like breathing or evolution. Number five, operations and actions. So these are actions by, say, humans or other entities, things like planning, designing, manufacturing. Instruments or agents of action, so these would be things like teachers, engineers, and so on. And then finally, again, place and time are pretty straightforward. And there are, by the way, more on both of these sort of types of uses of categories for subject analysis in your book. Now, finally, for sort of the last theoretical area that we'll cover here, I do want to talk briefly about how the IFLA family of models addresses subject analysis. Subject access has been a core part of the original Ferber model and also of the related family of models from Ferber onwards. So in Ferber, there were sort of a set of entities proposed by that original Ferber model, including concepts, objects, places, events, and then also all of the group 1 entities, so our resources, as well as group 2 entities, so our people and our corporate bodies. So those were sort of the approach in the Ferber model, was kind of listing out the various different types of things that could be subjects of resources. However, just as we mentioned last week that there is a separate sister model for authority data called FRAD, there was also, in the realm of subjects, a separate report that was published in 2010 called Functional Requirements for Subject Authority Data, sometimes pronounced as an acronym as FRSAD, which is unfortunate, but that's the sister model for subjects. So things were a little bit different under FRSAD. The model for subject access was quite a bit simplified. So basically there were two primary entities involved in the subject relationship. There was something called a thema, which basically is any entity that is used as the subject of a work. And then nomen was the term for a name for something that, or a name by which an entity is known by. Now, of course, as we have mentioned a couple of times, both Ferber and Fersad are now being replaced by the unified IFLA LRM, the Library Reference Model. And you can see in particular, I think, in the case of treatment of subject access, why this is one of the reasons that a unified model was needed, because there really are some differences between Ferber and the much later Fersad in the way that they treated subjects. So the IFLA LRM, generally speaking, I would say takes an approach that is closer to Fersad on representing subject access than it is to the original Ferber model. So the basic subject relationship in the IFLA LRM is what you see on your slide here. So we have works, and a work can have a subject. The subject is a res, so anything basically can be the subject of a work, anything in our sort of bibliographic universe. And then a res has an appellation of nomen. There's a name that a thing goes by, basically is what that means. So it's a relatively simple model in that way. You can also see, by the way, how this actually maps pretty well onto the sort of two-part subject analysis process that we talked about at the beginning of lecture last week pretty well. So first, we figure out the aboutness, right? Subject separate from any sort of controlled vocabulary. So figure out what the subject of the work is. And then second, we determine how to translate that aboutness into words or notation. So determine what nomen to use to represent that subject by. Now, res and work are the only elements in that sort of core has a subject, is a subject of relationship. So none of the other WEMI entities can have a subject in Ferber. You can't say the subject of this expression or this manifestation is blah, blah, blah. You can only say the subject of a work is X. And that sort of makes sense if you think of that WEMI hierarchy, because the work is really the intellectual core of that hierarchy, right? That's where the real intellectual content resides. But keep in mind, even though that looks awfully simple, right? Just work has a subject. That res, which represents the subject, can include absolutely any other entity in the IFLA LRM model. So res includes works, expressions, manifestations, items, agents, nomens, places, and time spans. So basically that means that anything in the model can be the subject of a work. So please do take a second to review the couple of handouts that we had from last week, in particular your things to consider handout, which lists a lot of the different kind of terms or categories that were listed in this part of the lecture. And I will see you next week.